Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniegolu. Now let's talk about one increasingly popular creative artist who's walking in the enormous shadow cast by his father. It could be said that art runs in the family. Oliver Enwonwu is the son of Nigeria's most celebrated 20th century visual artist, Ben Enwonwu. Today, Oliver is the president of the Society of Nigerian Artists, which is the organization that represents all practicing visual artists in this country. But beyond that, of course, he comes from a respected line of latter-day artists, which includes his famous grandfather, who was a respected traditional sculptor, and his father, of course, Nigeria's most celebrated 20th century visual artist, Ben Enwonwu. Throughout his career, Ben felt very strongly that a modern Nigeria should be rooted in its own heritage and history. But when it comes to ways of looking at art, how far has the apple fallen from the tree? Well, while a lot of his father's art seemed to speak nostalgically about Nigeria and of home, Oliver's inspiration appears to be more political, often challenging racial injustice and systemic prejudice.
These days things have broadened a whole lot, and in the world today globally it's getting smaller. The artist is somebody who has a vision, and there's art in everything. There's art in doing your hair, there's art in the way you speak, there's art in your body rhythm, the way you walk, you know. And the artist is a bigger person than just a decorative person who's just doing things to decorate a place, and art has gone way beyond.
And I'm suitably delighted to say that the man you saw in that video, Oliver Enwonwu, president of the Society of Nigerian Artists and son of the iconic Ben Enwonwu, joins me now from our studios in Lagos. He's got a bigger beard, but it's the same person behind that fuzz. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. And I do need to apologize for the fact that we couldn't get you on air when we actually wanted you, which was originally 24 hours ago, but we appreciate the fact that you were able to come in today. Let's start by talking a little bit about your father, who everybody knows about, and then we'll talk about you, who everybody is getting to know about. What do you think, or why do you think so many people at home and abroad connect so indelibly with your father's art? Is it the way he encompasses elemental things in his works? Is it the realism and the naturalism of it? Is it his examination of his own life and the life of others and turning that into some form of art, or what?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here. Never mind yesterday. I think that we'll more than make up for it today. Why are people so connected with my father's work? I think his work resonates with many Nigerians, even those generations before, that have gone before me, and many artists working today who have defined their practices against his many successes. I think that his art connects or resonates with these people, and still does, because his art was very aspirational. It defined Nigeria at a time when we were seeking our independence from our colonial masters. So I think it was very important because it championed the aspirations of the Nigerian people as it broke away from colonialism, as it started to define their own space, negotiate their own space, as individuals and as a collective. So I think that's why his work is really important, especially when you look at works like Enwonwu, which is very iconic. It stands today at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and it defined the people coming into their own, you know, having gone through such ills like colonialism, having been able to challenge Western stereotypes, you know, so it defined the people, their aspirations as they define themselves. So that's why I think his work is extremely important.
That's a very good point, because, I mean, it could be said that your father was actually on the cusp of both the culture and the politics of that time of Nigeria. So let me ask you this. If you were isolated on an island and you were given the option of choosing one of your father's paintings to take with you, I mean, which would it be? I mean, for me, I have to admit, it would have to be either that masterpiece, The Court of the Oba of Benin, or his Africa Dances series. I mean, which one of those would you like to keep you company in exile? Possibly Tutu, I don't know.
Well, I think that's a very difficult question because many of his pieces were very iconic. I mean, they're still very much in our national consciousness. But I think Tutu would be it for me. He did an iteration of 3. There were 3 in the series of Tutu. It was a young Ilefe princess, and she sat for him when she was about 17, and that painting has gone on to define us as people. I mean, when you look at the elegant lady, you think about how regal that she looks, and how for him the woman was an epitome of beauty and an epitome of incubation, of nurturing. So you see all of that in the work, and it defined us as people because it showed that the black woman or the black African or the black person all over the world should be judged by his own merits, and not by the color of his skin, or the texture of his hair. So I think for me, that reminds me of who I am, first and foremost, as an African, and a world citizen. So I think that is the work that if I was isolated, on an island and I had to take one of his pieces with me, that for me would be the work.
And of course, to further strengthen the point that you're making, I mean, that painting sold spectacularly well, didn't it? I mean, that's arguably one of the best-selling paintings ever out of Nigeria and Africa. I mean, it sold for almost $2 million. And how much did what your father do interest you at an early age? I'm kind of trying to evolve into who you've become yourself, an artist in your own right. I mean, how did what he did interest you at an early age? How much did that influence you and help you to decide to start creating your own art?
Well, a lot of it. I mean, he was a very hardworking person. We watched him potter around the house when he was always working and creating. He always wanted peace and quiet. So many a time we were little disturbances for him. But for the most part, especially when I began to appreciate what he was doing, he would invite me into the studio and I would help draw straight lines. Especially I remember, quite vividly when he was painting the first Chief Justice of Nigeria, indigenous Chief Justice of Nigeria, Sir Adetokunbo Ademola. And around that period, his hands were shaky, I mean, due to advancing age. And he asked me to just do straight lines because he had seen previously me draw quite well. And he had asked me to even repeat because I wanted to be sure that I wasn't tracing some of the drawings. So I think those early influences, must have, influenced me in this direction. And I find myself, even though I first studied the sciences at school, I found myself getting more into the visual arts. And of course, the rest is history. At King's College, I was the utility decorator for the college. He would help me with my class assignments. And of course, with his help, I would come tops in the class with art. But my first love was the sciences. I knew I had a famous father only when I got into secondary school. For me, before that, he was just daddy. And for even my siblings, it was just daddy until people started asking us questions, about him and about his work. But having developed that background, of course, the interest came. And even though I studied biochemistry and geophysics at university, I found myself increasingly drawn. So I see my art more as a calling, something that I just had to do because I was never satisfied with biochemistry or geophysics. I always felt that there was still something more that I had to study. And later on, as I started to become more accomplished as an artist, I began to find great fulfillment in it.
Well, I have to say that we're very glad indeed that you got into the art world. And I was going to ask you, how much would you say that you have in common with your father, Ben, in the style and composition and inspiration of your art?
Well, first of all, I think we have a thing for the Onitsha masquerade. Of course, we're both from Onitsha. He is very interested in their spirituality, same as I. I'm very interested in their spirituality. I don't seek an ethnographic semblance to these masquerades, but I think about them in the spiritual sense and how, that transition from the physical world to the spiritual world, I try to capture that in my work. And I try to capture the evolving dance. So my dance isn't so traditional in that sense, but it encompasses ballet, encompasses contemporary movements. So you see a lot of that in my work. Another similarity, I'd say, is our appreciation of African women. We see them as an incubator. I believe that in everything that they do, we see a lot of rhythm, and I like to capture rhythm and movement in my canvases. Points of difference include the fact that I work primarily as a painter, and he could switch from painting to sculpture at will because he was quite efficient at both, equal dexterity for me. But you see a lot of points of divergence. For instance, my figures are more realistic. I don't, my colors are different, our techniques are different. He is more of an artist who would paint directly on canvas. I work in layers because I'm working primarily with the old master techniques, which allow different layers to be translucent so that it has a luminous glow. So that is more painstaking. I prefer it that way, maybe because of my science background. I believe in a lot of optical illusions, and that you see because I studied physics, so I like a bit of that. I'm more faithful to the anatomy. He would elongate even more because his forms were highly stylized to conjure movement, but I'm a little different. I like to see things as they are, So I think those are primary points of divergence for both of us. Yes.
Absolutely fascinating listening to you talk about art there as it relates to you and your father. But beyond the fact that your work is clearly, as you said, more contemporary, more perhaps modernist, can it be said that it is also more political in terms of its content? Because, you often challenge racial injustice and systemic racism through your work, and it sort of shines through as a kind of political creed. Is there a philosophy behind your works?
Yes, I agree with you that I'm more politically charged. I have an exhibition coming up opening this Sunday, and the title of that exhibition is The Politics of Representation. I'm very interested in how we challenge Western stereotypes or negative stereotypes being thrust on us, as African people, stereotypes of corruption, stereotypes of the exotic, because many people believe that even the fine things that come from Africa are exotic. I challenge that a lot. I want to see Africans, being judged by who they are, the contents of their character. I think that's very important. So my work celebrates, a black achievement. I believe that even my portraits, are extremely important. And when you look at Western art history, you notice that a lot of Africans weren't celebrated. And even when black people were depicted in these portraits, you find out that they are depicted as slaves, in obedience. And for me, that's not how we should be represented. So I use Western techniques, I use the old master techniques, I use portraiture, as a canon in itself to challenge. So I'm using the very same tools that maybe the West many centuries ago used to make us subservient, to challenge the status quo and to bring us right into the fore, especially, in this century where it is very important for us to take our place. Yes.
Please stay with us. We're going to come right back and talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Oliver Enwonwu, President of the Society of Nigerian Artists and son of the eminent Nigerian visual artist Ben Enwonwu. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Enwonwu, now with major museums in London and New York showcasing leading contemporary African artists, and with many of them chalking up successes across the West. It looks like the world of art has finally put Africa on its map. And it's thanks in no small measure to the work of celebrated contemporary Nigerian artists like the Enwonwu family. Between grandfather, father and son, they've put out some of Africa's most iconic pieces of sculptures, wood carvings and paintings. Oliver, my guest today and president of the Society of Nigerian Artists, is the new kid on the block, but his art is in the ascendant, interrogating the complex history between Africa and the West and challenging racial injustice and systemic racism. Today, like his father Ben Enwonwu before him, Oliver's art is helping to drive the expansion of African art, increasing Africa's presence on the international art market with some of the most dynamic and important works. And Oliver Enwonwu, president of the Nigerian Society of Artists, is still with me from our studios in Lagos. Thank you so much for staying with us. Now, of course, different areas of art move in and out of favor with the times. Is this a good time for African art, or is this a less good time?
Well, I think it's a good time. I mean, you've mentioned that there's global attention on African art now, and I think that's because of our many experiences. For instance, we've gone through the movement from the traditional, when our artists were basically creating from what they saw. For instance, the materials around them, like the huge trees around, or many of our sculptors felled these trees down, and they created art that was characteristic for their geometric shapes and forms. And then with the advent of Christianity, the advent of Western education, many of the artists at that time schooled in Western institutions, and they began, to imbibe some of these Western techniques and fuse them, with, our own indigenous traditions and aesthetics. And then since that time, we've created art that is very rich because it takes the best of both worlds, sort of a fusion of a hybrid of something of some sort. And with ongoing advances in technology, with globalization, the world becoming smaller, with intercultural exchanges, with international residencies, our art is the better for it. And I think that maybe that's why there's so much global attention, because our art still remains true to its roots. Is it a good time for African art? Absolutely. I mean, many auctions all over the world now have departments for African art, and I think that's enough testimony to show that our art is beginning to arrive. I think it's not there yet, and there can still be there's still a lot to be done to ensure. For instance, we need the right infrastructure to ensure that this growth is sustainable. And when I mean infrastructure, I mean proper investment. First of all, the industry has to be mapped out properly for us to see the areas where investors can come in. There has to be ready-made, purpose-built museums, where you can see, a modern contemporary heritage being housed properly, for millions of visitors and audiences all over the world. I think that, for instance, you should have banks that are able to take collateral in form of paintings or artwork so that they can give collectors loans, and these collectors, of course, will in turn even buy more art and support artists. I think that there should be proper insurance companies that should insure art with specialized policies. I think these are extremely important, especially when there's now the rise of crypto art. Artists' intellectual property rights should be better protected. I think, these are things that will not only sustain growth, but to make sure that whatever successes we're recording now, don't end up as flukes. So it is a good time for African art. Many of us now, are schooled abroad. Many of us are exhibiting internationally. Many of us have international representation by galleries. And of course, with the internet advances on social media and all of that, the world has become a level playing field. So it boils down to the content. And I think that we have an abundance, and we have a plethora, of artists who are at their prime now that just need to be discovered.
Well, yes, and thanks for giving us a sense of the extent of that renaissance, even though it is still evolving, because, many artists, let's face it, many artists are still who are maybe not on your level or your father's level or stuff like that, are still unemployed and, and are still struggling to make saleable art in the present. But the movement is on. And it brings me back to that amazing painting of your father's tutu, because when it was last seen at the Italian Cultural Institute, I mean, it got missing for a while, and when it was seen there in 1975, where your father exhibited it, on the catalogue it said, "Not for sale." But then, of course, it later sold at auction, as we said, for almost $2 million at Bonham's auction house. Was that a characteristic of his paintings, in the sense that they were essentially priceless, and that's the whole point of the auctions, to find out what it's worth?
Well, funny enough, there were three in the series of tutu paintings. The one that you speak of, that was last exhibited, say in 1975, that you mentioned that it was exhibited, I wouldn't say last, but it was exhibited at the Italian Cultural Institute in 1975, was never sold. Up to his death in 1994, it was stolen. The one that was auctioned at Bonham's is a second one, which incidentally was missing, found, and then sold. But it's not the main tutu, the one that he signed very boldly, not only with his name, but where he painted it and at what time of the year, December 1973. That still remains a mystery, it's still stolen, it hasn't been discovered yet. And maybe when it surfaces, then we would know what is still missing. The one that was sold for almost $2 million at Bonham's in 2018, it's the second one of it. The third was also sold at Bonham's, but the first one still remains missing. Now, the second part of your question, you ask, is it characteristic of artists? I believe, just like my father did, that you can never really pay enough for an artwork. Putting a price on it, sort of demeans it in some sort of way, because it makes it a commodity. But true art doesn't really have a price, because it's like buying a part of your soul. It's a sum total of an artist's experiences, his life, what he's gone through, his reaction to stimulus. True art, for me, isn't really sold. And in Africa, we're Africans. We never really created art, to be sold. But art was a part of our life, our spiritual, religious or political life. You just need to look at the Kingdom of Benin pre-1897, when the British came and sacked and pillaged the kingdom. You will note that the art was first, religious. Secondly, it was to celebrate the achievements of the king, his political successes, to instill fear in the enemies, and of course to record great events and to celebrate their warriors and all of that. And that's why most of the art was for royalty, and that's why it's referred, even in academic circles, as the royal art of the Benin court. So our art wasn't really, to be looked upon or looked at or appreciated in museums or to be exchanged for money. True art, is a part of the artist's soul. So in that very sense, it makes it timeless. It makes it, something of inestimable value. So that's how I'll respond to your question.
Yes, well, that's a very interesting analysis. We've got less than a minute before we have to go, sadly, but I was dying to ask you this question. When you paint or you create art, do you focus on things that have made a deep personal impression on you, or do you pick sort of random images or occurrences and then sort of embellish them in your mind and subsequently in your art? And we've got about less than a minute.
Well, I'll give my response in less than a minute. I'll say both. First of all, you can only respond, because you've built up experiences, and your response will be very different to another artist, even if you lived with that artist all your life, how that artist would respond. So it becomes first deeply personal, and second, it's at the same time, all at once, at the same time, it's your response to stimulus. And many a time, I also research a lot, before creating. So it's what makes my art very interesting.
Okay.
Makes me want to stay away from the sciences that I was first in.
Oliver, I want to thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Oliver Enwonwu is president of the Society of Nigerian Artists and son of the iconic Ben Enwonwu. Thank you very much indeed. That's it. Bye-bye.